Welcome to another deep dive. We're tackling global exchange rate arrangements this time, going deeper than the usual headlines and really digging into how countries manage their currencies.
It's definitely a fascinating topic.
Yeah, it is. You sent over these excerpts from Carmen Reinhardt and Kenneth Rogoff's Modern History of Exchange Rate Arrangements, Reinterpretation.
Yeah,
Pretty long title.
it is.
Published in the Quarterly Journal of Economics in 2004.
Yeah,
This study really kind of throws a wrench in the traditional narrative of how exchange rates have evolved.
it really makes you think differently about how we understand exchange rates. It's fascinating how much we miss when we just focus on official exchange rates.
Right.
It's like trying to understand a city by only looking at a map.
Oh, yeah, I see what you're saying.
You miss all the bustling streets, the hidden alleyways, the heartbeat of the place. When we bring in those market-determined rates, including those operating in parallel markets,
Yeah.
we get a much richer, much more nuanced understanding of how exchange rate policies really function.
I like that analogy. This is where it gets really interesting. Reinhardt and Rogoff, they argue that relying solely on those official rates, it's like judging a book by its cover.
Yeah, you get a basic idea, but you're missing out on all those juicy details and hidden complexities within.
Exactly. And you know what surprised me the most was their finding that back in 1950, over half the countries they studied had multiple exchange rate systems in place.
Yeah,
That definitely challenges the classic view of the Bretton Woods era as a time of purely fixed exchange rates.
absolutely. And this wasn't limited to developing nations.
Right.
Even some industrialized European economies, they relied heavily on these dual exchange rate systems in the decades after World War II. It's a powerful reminder that the history of exchange rate arrangements is far more complex than we often assume.
It is a powerful reminder, so let's unpack this. Imagine you're trying to buy a car in 1950s France, and there's an official fixed exchange rate for the French francs. But then you discover this whole parallel market where the francs is trading at a significantly different value. What?
This is where the concept of parallel markets comes in.
Right.
These markets, they emerge when the official exchange rate, it doesn't accurately reflect the true forces of supply and demand for a currency.
Oh, I see. Okay, so they're like a release valve.
Right. They provide an alternative avenue for individuals and businesses to exchange currencies at a rate that's closer to their perceived market value.
Okay. But were these parallel markets just like a small-time side hustle, or were they something more significant? Reinhardt and Rogoff, they actually delved into export misinvoicing data,
Right?
a common way to circumvent official exchange rates.
And what they found was truly eye-opening. There were massive leakages from official channels,
Wow.
particularly in regions like the Caribbean and Sub-Saharan Africa. This suggests that parallel markets, they were playing a much bigger role in the global economy than most people realized. These weren't just minor inconveniences. They represented a substantial portion of economic activity taking place outside the official system.
Wow. So what you're saying is that these parallel markets, they were like a hidden undercurrent shaping global finance in ways that were often overlooked.
Precisely. By analyzing export misinvoicing data, Reinhardt and Rogoff were able to quantify the extent of these hidden flows. It's like uncovering a secret network of tunnels beneath a seemingly well-ordered city.
That's a great way to put it. It's almost like these parallel markets were acting as a pressure valve, releasing economic tensions that the official system just couldn't handle.
Yeah, I like that.
But this leads us to another crucial point. Reinhardt and Rogoff argue that many currencies officially labeled as floating weren't truly floating at all.
Right.
They were heavily managed by governments to limit fluctuations.
This speaks to the concept of fear of floating,
Right.
a term coined by Calvo and Reinhardt. It describes the reluctance of many countries to allow their currencies to fluctuate freely,
Okay.
even when they claim to have adopted a floating exchange rate system.
I see.
This fear often stems from concerns about economic volatility and political pressure.
Right, like we want the benefits of a floating exchange rate, like the ability to adjust to external shocks. But they're also afraid of the potential downsides, like rapid depreciation or excessive volatility.
Exactly. And this fear of floating can lead to all sorts of interventions and manipulations in the currency market. So even when a country claims to have a floating exchange rate, the reality might be much more complex.
It might be. To further complicate things, Reinhardt and Rogoff introduced a new category that is a bit unsettling, to say the least. Freely falling exchange rates.
Yeah.
They use this term to describe situations where a country is experiencing extremely high inflation, exceeding 40% annually. It turns out these freely falling currencies were much more common than truly freely floating ones, which is pretty wild.
And this distinction is incredibly important because lumping freely falling currencies with stable low inflation floaters, It distorts our understanding of how exchange rate regimes truly impact economic outcomes.
Right. Yeah. Think of it like this. We wouldn't group a Category 5 hurricane with a gentle summer breeze simply because they both involve wind.
Right.
The same applies to exchange rates. We need to be more precise with our language and categories if we want to grasp the full spectrum of experiences.
Absolutely.
Reinhardt and Rogoff, they even provide a compelling example, comparing the Canadian dollar, which has genuinely floated,
Right.
to the Argentine peso during its period of hyperinflation. Both were officially labeled as floating, but their trajectories look vastly different, with the peso experiencing extreme volatility and rapid depreciation.
Right. Yeah.
So what we're seeing here is that the way we traditionally categorize exchange rates, fixed versus floating, doesn't capture the full complexity of the real world. There's a lot more nuance and variation than those simple labels suggest.
And this is where Reinhardt and Rogoff's work is so groundbreaking.
Yeah.
It challenges us to move beyond those simplistic categories and to look deeper into the data, the historical context, and the specific policies that countries are actually implementing.
Absolutely. It's like looking beneath the surface to see what's really going on.
Exactly.
You know, one of the things that struck me while reading this study was how it changes our understanding of the Bretton Woods system. We often think of it as this golden age of fixed exchange rates and global monetary stability,
Yeah.
but Reinhardt and Rogoff paint a much more nuanced picture.
Yeah, they highlight that true exchange rate stability during Bretton Woods was actually quite short-lived. Particularly in those early years before widespread currency convertibility, many countries, they were relying on those dual exchange rate systems in parallel markets
Yeah.
to manage their economies, making the system far more flexible and adaptable than we often give it credit for.
That's a great point. It's like we've been looking at Bretton Woods through a nostalgic lens, focusing on the intended outcome of stability without acknowledging the messy reality of how countries were actually operating within the system.
And the data really backs this up. If you look at charts of parallel market premiums in the decades after World War II, you see a significant amount of volatility, even in industrialized nations.
Wow.
This clearly indicates that exchange rates were not nearly as fixed as they might have appeared on the surface.
So the idea of a clean break from fixed to floating exchange rates after the Bretton Woods system collapsed in the early 1970s, well, more complicated than that, isn't it?
Absolutely. The transition was far more gradual and messy than many textbooks suggest.
Right.
Many countries, especially in the developing world, they continued to rely on managed exchange rates and various forms of capital controls well into the 1980s and even beyond.
It makes you wonder if the narrative of the inevitable rise of floating exchange rates is more of an oversimplification than a reflection of historical reality. Maybe it's less about inevitability and more about a complex interplay of economic and political forces shaping global monetary systems over time.
Exactly, and that's why Reinhardt and Rogoff's work is so valuable. It challenges us to rethink our assumptions about how exchange rate regimes have evolved, and to look for those often overlooked dynamics operating beneath the surface.
Speaking of overlooked dynamics, let's circle back to those freely falling currencies. They seem to have been hiding in plain sight all along while everyone was focused on the fixed versus floating debate.
It's as if we were so preoccupied with classifying currencies as either fixed or floating that we failed to notice this entire category of exchange rate experiences, characterized by extreme volatility and rapid depreciation.
And lumping those hyperinflationary economies in with stable floaters isn't just an academic quibble, is it? It has real-world implications for how we analyze and understand economic data.
You're absolutely right. If you're studying the impact of exchange rate regimes on economic growth, for example, and you're not differentiating between a freely falling currency and a stable floater, your conclusions are likely to be misleading. It'd be like trying to analyze the effects of weather patterns without distinguishing between a gentle rain shower and a raging hurricane.
That's a great analogy. You need to differentiate between those extremes if you want to make meaningful comparisons and draw accurate conclusions.
Precisely. And Reinhardt and Rogoff's research suggests that freely falling currencies are often a symptom of deeper economic instability. They tend to be associated with high inflation, low growth, and a general lack of confidence in the government and its policies.
So it's not just about the exchange rate itself, it's about what that exchange rate tells us about the underlying health and stability of a country's economy. It's like a canary in a coal mine, signaling potential problems that might not be immediately apparent from other economic indicators.
Exactly. And this highlights the importance of context when analyzing exchange rate regimes. You can't just look at a currency's label, fixed, floating, or whatever, and draw meaningful conclusions. You need to understand the historical, the political, and economic forces that have shaped that country's exchange rate policies and outcomes.
This might be a good time to pause and bring our listener into the conversation. What stands out to you as particularly surprising or thought-provoking about these findings? Have you ever encountered situations in your work or travels where the official exchange rate just didn't seem to reflect the reality on the ground?
I'm particularly struck by the persistence of dual exchange rate systems and parallel markets. Even in today's globalized world with sophisticated financial instruments and institutions, we still see countries resorting to these kinds of measures when their economies come under pressure. It's a reminder that the desire to control a currency's value, it remains strong, even though history has repeatedly shown that such efforts often backfire.
It's like this eternal struggle between market forces and government intervention. Governments want to maintain stability and control, but markets they're constantly pushing back, seeking equilibrium based on supply and demand. And sometimes that tension leads to the emergence of these shadow markets where the real value of a currency is determined.
And it makes you wonder how these dynamics will play out in the future. As technology continues to advance, as financial markets become even more interconnected, will we see new and even more creative ways of managing exchange rates emerge? Or will we finally learn from the past and embrace a more truly flexible and market-driven system?
That's the million-dollar question, isn't it? Only time will tell. But one thing is, certain Reinhardt and Rogoff's study has provided us with a valuable framework for understanding the complexities of exchange rate arrangements, and their insights will undoubtedly continue to inform our thinking for years to come.
I completely agree. One of the key takeaways for me, at least, is the importance of being skeptical of official pronouncements about exchange rates. We need to look beyond the labels and delve deeper into the data, the market realities, and the historical context to get a complete picture.
It's a reminder that the world of exchange rates is rarely black and white. There's a whole spectrum of experiences and arrangements out there. And understanding those nuances is crucial if we want to make sense of global finance and the forces shaping the global economy. As we go deeper into the study, I keep finding myself coming back to this fear of floating idea.
Yeah,
It really challenges our assumptions about how countries, especially those with developed economies, approach exchange rate management.
right.
We often assume that countries with more developed economies and open capital markets, they'd prefer to let their currencies float freely. I mean, a freely floating exchange rate, it can act as a buffer against external shocks, helping to absorb economic fluctuations and maintain stability.
It's like having a built-in suspension system for your economy, smoothing out the bumps along the road.
Exactly. But what Reinhardt and Rogoff highlight is that even in these seemingly ideal conditions, many countries remain hesitant to fully embrace a freely floating exchange rate. They cling to some degree of control, intervening in currency markets and implementing policies to manage fluctuations.
Right.
So what's driving this fear? Why are so many countries, even those with sophisticated financial systems, reluctant to let their currencies truly float?
Well, there are several factors at play. For starters, freely floating exchange rates could be inherently volatile,
Yeah,
subject to rapid and unpredictable swings in value.
yeah, I can see that.
This volatility, it can create uncertainty for businesses, making it difficult to plan investments and engage in international trade,
Yeah.
right?
It's understandable that businesses would prefer a more stable and predictable environment.
Exactly.
Trying to operate in a context where your currency is constantly fluctuating would be like trying to build a house on shifting sand.
And for countries that rely heavily on international trade, those volatile exchange rates can disrupt trade flows and impact their overall economic performance. Imagine a country whose currency suddenly depreciates sharply. Their exports become cheaper, which sounds good,
Right.
but their imports become much more expensive, potentially leading to inflation and other economic challenges.
Yeah. And we can't forget about the political dimension. Governments are often concerned about the public's reaction to a depreciating currency.
Right.
It can be perceived as a sign of economic weakness or mismanagement, even if it's simply a natural response to market forces.
That's a crucial point. A sharp depreciation can erode public confidence in the government's economic policy,
Yeah.
leading to capital flight, social unrest, a host of other problems. So even if a government understands the theoretical benefits of a freely floating exchange rate,
Right.
they might be reluctant to risk the potential political backlash.
It seems like they're caught in a delicate balancing act, trying to reach the benefits of a floating exchange rate while mitigating the potential downsides. It's a tightrope walk between flexibility and control.
And that's why we see so many countries opting for what Reinhardt and Rogoff call managed floating. They try to strike that balance, intervening in currency markets to smooth out fluctuations and keep their currencies within a desired range, using various tools and policies to guide the exchange rate without completely fixing it.
Right. Sounds like a constant game of tug of war between allowing market forces to determine the exchange rate and stepping in to manage those forces when things get too volatile or unpredictable.
That's a great way to put it. And this constant adjustment and recalibration is what makes the study of exchange rate arrangements so fascinating. It's not a static system. It's constantly evolving, influenced by a complex interplay of economic, political, and even social factors.
So where does this leave us? What are the key takeaways from our deep dive into Reinhardt and Rogoff's groundbreaking research?
Well, for me, it reinforces the idea that exchange rate arrangements, they're never truly fixed. They're always in flux, shaped by a dynamic interplay of forces adapting to changing circumstances and reflecting the priorities and constraints of the countries involved.
It's a reminder that there's no one-size-fits-all approach to exchange rate management. What works for one country might not work for another, and what works at one point in time might not work later on. It's a constant process of learning, adapting, and finding the right balance for each unique situation.
Exactly. And that's why Reinhardt and Roboff's study remains so relevant today, even though it was published over 2 decades ago. The insights they offer into the history, the complexities and nuances of exchange rate arrangements, they provide a valuable framework for understanding how countries navigate the challenges of managing their currencies in a globalized world.
It's been a truly fascinating journey exploring the intricate world of exchange rate arrangements, uncovering hidden dynamics, challenging conventional wisdom. I hope our listener has found it as insightful and engaging as we have.
Me too. If there's one thing I hope listeners take away from this deep dive, it's a sense of curiosity
Yeah.
and a desire to continue exploring these issues. The world of exchange rates is constantly changing, and there's always more to learn and discover.
Absolutely. And perhaps as global financial markets continue to evolve, as new technologies emerge, and as we face new global challenges, we'll need to rethink our approaches to exchange rate management. Maybe we'll even invent entirely new categories and systems to better reflect the ever-changing realities of global finance.
That's an intriguing thought. The future of exchange rate arrangements is uncertain, but one thing is for sure. It will continue to be a fascinating area of study, full of surprises, challenges, and opportunities.
Well said. This has been an enlightening deep dive, and I'm grateful to have had the opportunity to explore these ideas with you and our listener. Until next time, keep questioning, keep learning, and keep exploring the intricate world of global finance. That's all for today's deep dive. We hope you found this exploration informative and engaging.